Rachel Rice, and I'm the Director of Community and Media Relations here at the University of Maine at Presque Isle. And as some of you already know, I also happen to be married to somebody who also works here at the University of Maine at Presque Isle. I'm the president, Ray Rice, and he and my daughter are unable to be here for the very first part of this presentation. So I am here to pass along his apologies that he couldn't be here to join us for the first part of this, but I'm here to do the official welcome on behalf of the university. Events like what is happening tonight are a very important part of the work that we do as a university to bring distinguished lecturers to the area and to provide that opportunity for us to hear a diverse range of topics. We were absolutely delighted when Steve Richard from Central Heuristic Association reached out to President Rice to ask if we could partner together to help out with this, and obviously he was on board very quickly. So I wanted to just give a big thank you to Steve and to Carl and to everybody else who helped to make tonight possible. He's very pleased to just play a very small part in providing this space for us to bring Clarence Sundrum here. So with that, I'd like to turn the time over to Steve.
We also like to thank the University of Presque Isle for partnering with us, the Central Heuristic Association, to bring Clarence up here to lecture on the persons with developmental disabilities. But I also want to thank our additional sponsors. MMG Insurance also helped sponsor this, Bresci's Financial, Thompson and Hamill, United Insurance, and Beavis and Rossignol were all part of giving monies to be able to bring Clarence here and to be able to do this event. So certainly want to thank the sponsors. Now, why are we here? We're here because Central Heuristic Association is celebrating its 60th year of providing services to persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities here in Heuristic County. Now, probably a lot of people don't know that we have been around for 60 years. And obviously, over those 60 years, we've seen a lot of growth in what we have done. We've seen growth in our programs, we've seen growth in the numbers of individuals that we were able to serve. But most importantly, we've seen growth in the community support that we have received over all these years. And obviously, we're very appreciative of that. So I'm going to not speak much about this, other than the fact that in August, we're also going to have some fun events. This is a very serious event that we're putting on tonight, but in August we're going to have the Star City Syndicate that's going to be on our campus. We're going to do a movie in the park, we're going to have a car show, we're going to have a hot dog roast, we're going to have a human foosball tournament. So those will be the fun things that will take part. I see Ed Terry going, yes, it will be. But tonight we have a very special person that I had the great opportunity to work with years ago. And I shouldn't say work with, I was the chair of the Consumer Advisory Board for years, and Clarence Sundrum was the special master that was appointed to oversee the Pineland Consent Decree, back then just known as the Consent Decree, and worked with him for several years. Certainly enjoyed him, certainly recognized the impact that he's had, not only here in the state of Maine, but in New York and third world countries. So it was a pleasure when he said, yes, I would be more than glad to be that keynote speaker that will come in and kick off your 60th celebration. So with that, I'm going to introduce Adam Swanson, who is our vice president of our board, who will do the introduction of Clarence. But I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. I realize that there are roads that are flooding here in Aroostook County, so for those of you who were able to be here, thank you all very, very much. And Adam, I'll bring you up now.
Good evening. My name is Adam Swanson, and as Steve mentioned, I serve as the Vice President to the Board of Directors of Central Heuristic Association. I'd like to welcome you to what will be a very informative evening. It's a distinct honor to introduce tonight's lecturer, Clarence Sundrum. Clarence is best known in Maine for his oversight of the Special Court Master of the Adult Intellectual Disability Consent Decree or what Steve referred to as the Pineland Consent Decree. Mr. Sundram has participated in international efforts to reform mental health services throughout the world. He's consulted with organizations such as UNICEF and the World Health Organization. He's been influential in the areas of abuse, neglect, and exploitation through testimony regarding legislation in New York, Maine, Massachusetts, and Washington, D.C. For the past 20 years, he served as the founding chairman of the New York State Commission on Quality of Care for the Mentally Disabled, which is an independent state oversight agency. He's consulted for the U.S. Department of Justice and in more than 20 states and Canadian provinces on issues of protection from abuse, neglect and exploitation, investigations, restraint and seclusion, and quality assurance and risk management. He's published numerous articles in legal and other professional journals and is a frequent speaker at national conferences. He's appeared on programs such as Nightline, 48 Hours, and the CBS Evening News. Clarence resides in New York, and he currently serves as assistant counsel to Governor Andrew Cuomo. This evening, Mr. Sundram will be speaking on the historical evolution and reform of the human services system and ending reliance on large institutions with the development of community-based services. Central Aroostook Association is pleased that Mr. Sundram accepted our offer to help celebrate our 60 years of providing services to persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities in Aroostook County. Ladies and gentlemen, Clarence Sundram.
Good evening. When I listen to an introduction like this, there's always a risk that you, first of all, you believe all the nice things people say about you, and secondly, that you get a little bit of a swelled head. So I always try to remind myself of my first speaking engagement, because it brings me a little bit of humility. As Adam mentioned, I was appointed by the governor of New York to chair a commission. I was a young guy at the time. And when I was appointed to chair this commission that was going to oversee all of the mental health and developmental disability system in New York, there was a little story in the paper about my appointment. They put it next to the used car ads. But nevertheless, I thought, this is the start of something big and great. And sure enough, a couple of weeks went by, and I got a letter from a women's association in a small town called Coshocton Center. It's actually smaller than Presque Isle, but they wanted me to come and speak. And I thought, well, this is wonderful, that the fame is starting, and I'm getting the invitations. So I hastily accepted the invitation, and on the appointed day, I showed up in this small town of Coshocton Center, and they had a little hall where this event was going to be, where I was supposed to speak to this group. And, I was dressed in a nice three-piece suit, a little watch chain, prepared to wow these people with the great things that I was going to do running this new commission, the only one of its kind in the country. And I was met at the door by a very elegantly dressed lady who spoke in the clipped, correct accents of somebody who'd obviously gone to the best schools. And I was very nervous. And I started babbling about, this commission that had just been created. It was the first of its kind in the country, and we were going to oversee all these mental institutions, and we were going to reform them. And, I got nervous. And I realized that as I was talking to her, that she looked more and more confused the more I spoke. And after a while, she put her hand on my arm and said, "Mr. Sundram, what on earth are you talking about?" And I said, "I'm talking about this new commission, first of its kind in the country. It's the first independent agency to oversee the largest mental hygiene system in the free world. Isn't that what you asked me to come and talk here about?" And she said, "No." she said, my group had heard that the governor had this lawyer from India on his staff, and we were interested in hearing about the child marriage laws in India. So, I had this really sinking feeling as I was sitting on a dais, you know, and they were going through their motions and reading minutes and so on, and I was contemplating getting up in front of these nice women and making a complete ass of myself. But, you know, you don't go to law school for nothing. So I excused myself. I went into, there was a little room on the side with a little couch in it, and I went in there and I whipped out some index cards and started making notes. And I was trying to recall, you know, what I might have heard about the child marriage laws when I was in India. You know, hoping and praying and chastising myself for not paying attention during class when they were teaching civics. And then when I realized the paucity of my knowledge about these laws, I relied on creative writing. Started to think about things that were plausible, that might have been true. And then I realized that as little as I might know about the child marriage laws in India, there was a pretty good chance they knew even less. So as I was sitting there, you know, exercising this creative spark in myself, the hostess walked into the room, and she saw me sitting there scribbling on these cards. And she said, Mr. Sundram, is everything all right? And I said, sure, everything's fine. I'm totally in control. And she said, no, really, seriously, is everything all right? I said, yes, everything's all right. Why do you keep asking me? She said, I'm just wondering what you're doing sitting here in the ladies' room. So, with that dose of humility, let me just say I'm very honored to have been asked to come and speak here on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of the Central Aroostook Association and its collaboration with the University of Maine at Presque Isle. Like any anniversary, it's an occasion to celebrate the accomplishments and the hard work of so many people that it took to get us to the point where we are, to reflect on the journey that we've traveled, and to look forward, and also to chart a course forward. Before coming here, Steve Richard had given me a copy of the book, The Little Room at St. Luke's, which is a history of the association. And as I was reading it last night, what struck me was how similar the story of your origins and growth and evolution has been to the story of countless other groups just like yours all across the country. I know the New York City ARC the best, and I've heard the story from the parents who helped form that association. And the parallels are just amazing. And it is really these small groups of people across the country that started a revolution that I don't think even they could have envisioned would have led to the degree of progress that has been made over the last 60 or 70 years in the care of people with intellectual disabilities. And it's, in my judgment, the most successful human service reform anywhere in this country, the most enduring thus far that we have achieved. And before I start, I'd just like to get a sense of who's in the audience, because I'd like to know who I'm talking to. So how many of you are people who work in the field of intellectual and developmental disabilities? How many of you are students?
I'm one.
Yes. And how many of you are parents of people with disabilities? Okay, great. So for the younger people who are here, some of what I'm going to talk about may sound like a history lesson. For the older people, it may be a trip down memory lane as you hear about things that you've lived through and you know firsthand, and perhaps you've had a hand in making these things happen. George Santayana warned that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So with this piece of wisdom, I thought it would be worthwhile to visit the recent history that brought us to where we are today, and to consider what lessons we might draw upon from experience that have something to teach us about the challenges that we face now and are going to face in the future. The historian David Rothman wrote about the tension between conscience and convenience in the development of social policy in colonial times. And it seems to me that as I look back, not only over the distant history, but more recent events that have occurred, that struggle between conscience and convenience is very much with us today, and it continues to influence the development and implementation of public policy. So I'd like to talk about this tension and the continuing challenge it presents, particularly in this field of intellectual and developmental disabilities, throughout periods of change and upheaval. In the course of doing so, I'm going to digress a little bit into international human rights law and talk about the status of people with intellectual disabilities across the world as a backdrop for the changes that were taking place in the United States and here in Maine. One of the lessons that history teaches us is that change is hard, even if it's for the better. Today, psychologists tell us that the process of change is so traumatic that people will often cling to the comfort of the status quo, even if they don't like it. Change creates uncertainty. A familiar reality must be discarded before a new reality can take its place. And there's typically a period of confusion and disorientation and resistance that occurs. And experience teaches us that change is not always for the better, so the caution is not misplaced. Now, before I go any further, I should just say a couple of words about language, because I know that in this field we have struggled with words, and words that have hurt the sensibilities of people. And we've gone from using terms like moron and imbecile and idiot to calling people mentally defective, mentally retarded, developmentally disabled, intellectually disabled, and using people-first language. In this talk, I'm going to be using the terminology that was in effect at the time of the events that I'm discussing, and it's not done with any intention to hurt anybody's feelings, but simply to reflect history as it occurred. Now, if you go back into history, it's very easy to see the idealism with which the first schools for people with mental retardation were created in the 1850s. Their articulated purpose at that time was to provide educational and vocational facilities to train people to participate in society, to bring people with mental retardation out of the hiding places and abandonment on the fringes of society. People who were living in basements and attics of their family homes because families couldn't bear the shame and stigma of having a disabled relative. The less fortunate were consigned to almshouses and the poorhouses in colonial America, where neglect and abuse was rife. The first institutions that were developed, and Maine, by the way, was a late starter. The first institution, the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded in Pownell, didn't open until 1903. But it was like many other institutions of its era. These were originally intended as an alternative to the almshouses and poorhouses of colonial America. They were not intended as places just of confinement, but rather were designed and intended to help people who could be trained and educated and to return them to the communities where they'd come from so they could function there. If you read historical accounts of these institutions, they would talk about places in which residents were trained in vocational, social, educational, and recreational skills and held various jobs in the facility before they were placed back into the community. So when it was originally conceived, the institution was a great reform over the prevailing practices in the poorhouses and in the almshouses. But this conscience-driven reform and the idea of a pastoral safe haven and a temporary refuge was strangled in its crib by the demands of convenience. These quickly led to overcrowding, to understaffing, and eventually to the abandonment of the inmates by society at large. The reform, the conscience-driven reform, ran into a host of practical problems. The reformers miscalculated how hard the task would be. They misunderstood the diverse nature of the population that they had undertaken to serve. They misread the patience of the constituency groups to whom they had sold their reforms. and they soon became overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the task, the paucity of resources, and the scarcity of allies, especially in serving the large percentage of institutional residents who are recent immigrants or the working poor. Now you might ask, what were immigrants and the working poor doing in institutions that were designed for people with mental disabilities? Well, here's an important lesson of follow the money. When the poorhouses and almshouses were operated, the towns and villages bore the cost of running these places. If you transferred the residents to a state institution, the state bore the cost. So it became easy for the towns and villages to unload their population by sending them off to the state institution. And that soon resulted in vastly increasing the population of the institutions. Reformers learned firsthand the hard truth that the Queen in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass said, "It takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you want to get someplace else, you must run at least twice as fast." But they couldn't. And the institutions that were born in such great promise soon became custodial warehouses. For many, one could truthfully have posted the caution from Dante's Inferno, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." Now, the advent of the eugenics era towards the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century began to change the whole notion of the initial reform. The idea that people who had mental deficiencies would be temporarily housed in an institution, rehabilitated, and then returned to the community was abandoned. Instead, a medical model was adopted in which the institution, under the direction of physicians, assumed total control over the lives of the residents. Aggressive efforts were made to identify and to confine large numbers of people living on the margins of society and to prevent them from reproducing. Dr. Walter Fernald, who was one of the leading proponents supporting the creation of institutions, is quoted as saying, "The feeble-minded are a parasitic, predatory class, never capable of self-support or managing their own affairs. They cause unutterable sorrow at home and are a menace and danger to the community. Feeble-minded women are almost invariably immoral, and if at large, usually become carriers of venereal disease or give birth to children who are as defective as themselves. Every feeble-minded person, even the high-grade imbecile, is a potential criminal." But during this era, we saw the advent of laws that permitted the incarceration of youth who were, quote, morally depraved or in danger of becoming morally depraved. And not surprisingly, these laws were predominantly used against young women who were suspected of being sexually active. Again, clinicians held vast discretion to identify those who would be locked up and sterilized. And not surprisingly, these laws were usually applied against the poor, the undereducated, and people with mental disabilities. And it led to the practice of sterilization of large numbers of people to stamp out what were believed to be the seeds of deviance. Institutions became larger and more custodial, and the population changed, especially as the institutions became dependent upon the free labor of the residents to maintain the facilities and to work in the farms which supported them. Once again, the demands of convenience, coupled with the vast discretion given to the clinicians, shaped public policy and the lives of untold thousands of people who could not be released because the institution had grown dependent on their unpaid labor. My point is that the power of convenience should not be underestimated. Even as respected a body as the United States Supreme Court has fallen under its spell. In justifying the involuntary sterilization of a young woman who was thought to be feeble-minded, the respected Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote with brutal honesty about the convenience which justified their decision to permit this life-altering assault upon the body of Carrie Buck. He wrote, We have seen more than once that the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives. It would be strange if we could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices, often not felt by those concerned, in order to prevent our being swamped with incompetence. It is better for all the world, instead of waiting to execute the degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. This quotation tells us a lot about the stigma of disability and how it affects even the highest of minds. Our language today may be more polite, but the attitudes that they represent still exist. For most of the next 100 years, even the professionals charged with providing services essentially abandoned any hope, especially when it came to the more severely and profoundly disabled residents. So completely was this group written off that even at the dawn of the New Deal, when the Social Security Act of 1935 was enacted, it made no provisions at all for people with mental handicaps. In many states, children with mental retardation were specifically excluded by law and regulation from the benefits of the crippled children's provisions of the Social Security Act. And of course, they were excluded from public schools, so they had nowhere to go. It fell to parents, like those who formed this association, to create programs and to educate and train their children to function as well as they could, often with little or no help from their government. The stigma of disability and relegating people with disabilities to a lesser status as human beings was not a uniquely American experience, but it reflected a more universal attitude. Now let me ask you, what do you think it is that distinguishes a person with mental or intellectual disabilities from everybody else? Anybody?
How other people treat them?
How other people treat them, sure, yes. And why do you think that is?
Because they think that they're less than?
Because?
They think that they're less than others?
Yes.
I got something to say. I noticed that people like to pick on people with disabilities.
That's very true. And I think one of the reasons is that unlike anybody else, when you can challenge a person's ability to think, you can substitute your decision-making for theirs. If you or I went to the hospital because we had a heart disease or cancer or even gangrene that was eating up a limb, and the doctor prescribed a treatment, you could say no. And nobody would do anything about it. They would respect that decision. If you have an intellectual disability, somebody is going to say, we don't think you know what you're doing. Let's get a guardian here to make a decision for you. And I think that's a fundamental change that has affected the way in which people with mental disabilities have been treated historically. The theme that runs through history is that people with mental disabilities are among the most ignored groups when it comes to protection through the law. It's my broad perspective that institutional systems, especially for people with intellectual and mental disabilities, historically have existed or have regarded themselves as existing outside the rules of law, custom, and practice that applies to most of the rest of medical and clinical care, and indeed that applies to most of the rest of society. In significant respects, the institutionalized population in particular have lived outside the protection of the laws that protect everybody else, and there is a long tradition of regarding them in this fashion. That sounds pretty shocking. Right? I know there's a couple of lawyers in this room who are probably saying, that doesn't sound right. Well, for example, the enforcement of the penal laws has rarely extended into institutions where thefts, assaults, rapes, and the occasional murder have occurred and have gone unreported, uninvestigated, unprosecuted, and unpunished. The rights that prisoners of war and convicted criminals have had to at least an hour of outdoor fresh air and exercise was not recognized and routinely denied in institutions serving people with mental disabilities across America. They are so ignored that even mainstream human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have gone into different countries but paid very little attention to what's happening in their mental institutions. There are no prisoners of conscience there, although there are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who are locked up with a claim of mental disability, with no evidence of disability and with no process to challenge their confinement, which can last a lifetime. In my travels around the world, I have met children who were born in institutions, probably the product of rape, who have grown up and spent their lives there with no prospect of ever being released. In preparing for this talk, I did some research and I found that in the last century alone, there were 24 international human rights conventions adopted by the international community. And here are a few examples. And you'll see these are conventions that deal with subjects like slavery, and forced labor, exploitation of persons, rights of disadvantaged and confined people, prisoners of war, women, children, racial minorities. But what is interesting is that none of these conventions adopted in the 20th century mention disability. None. Although people with disabilities have been subject to peonage and forced labor in institutions for most of the 20th century. As I said before, they've had fewer rights than prisoners of war or convicted criminals. They've been subjected to physical and sexual abuse, to torture, to cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, misuse of restraints and seclusion for months at a time, and placement in cages, which have caused serious injuries and death. So a few pictures are probably worth more words. So this is a picture of a patient in Turkey being given electroconvulsive therapy. Now this is a treatment typically for depression, and normally the way ECT works is it produces a full body seizure where every muscle in your body contracts, and the force of the contraction is so powerful that it can cause fractures and tearing of muscles and tendons. So in civilized society, ECT is given with muscle relaxants and anesthesia. In Turkey, the patient is held down forcibly and ECT is administered without anesthesia, a practice that the International Committee on the Prevention of Torture has called torture, but it goes on. In Indonesia, patients are shackled to the walls of these rooms in which they are held. This is supposed to be an institution for people with mental disabilities, but there isn't very much treatment going on in this place. In Czechoslovakia, people are kept in cages, and here's a young man who has outgrown the cage that he is in and is unable to physically stand upright and has to keep his legs bent in order to stay in this cage. And he's let out to have a shower once a week and to use the bathroom when he needs to. This boy whom I met in Paraguay came into the institution at the age of 6 or 7. They weren't quite sure what his age was. He was diagnosed with autism, although the person who did the diagnosis was not a qualified clinician. And at the time I met him, he'd been in that cage for 12 years. This is Argentina, in which adult inmates of a psychiatric hospital are kept in a pen, and when it's time for a bath, they turn on a water hose and spray that area down. In a social care home in Bulgaria, these women spend their day in this pen. This is the female ward at that same institution in Indonesia. And you can see many of the women don't have clothes. And this place is significantly overcrowded, and again, there's no treatment whatsoever. And here what you're seeing is a manufacturing of disability. This child in an institution in Turkey, where there's no therapy of any kind going on, so the children tend to self-stimulate, and he was scratching his eyes. So the solution was not to give him the stimulation or program, but to put these plastic leather bottles that are taped to his hands, so he can no longer feel his fingers. And pediatricians will tell you that the important part of development is learning the motor coordination and what your limbs can do. And that child is being denied the opportunity to have that experience, and that is going to retard the development of his brain in a normal way, and they're, in this process, manufacturing disability. So it's easy to think about this as just stuff that happens elsewhere in the world. Let me just show you something else. This is a video of Willowbrook. This is an institution in New York.
1972. The sounds, patients inside Willowbrook State School.
It was supposed to be a place to help children and adults with developmental disabilities. Instead, the city's most vulnerable were neglected, abused, and worse.
At nighttime, being raped and just routinely.
I get beaten, Bill.
At the age of 3, Bernard Carabello entered Willowbrook, grossly and offensively misdiagnosed with what was then called mental retardation.
And parents would be told that they would be happier if they were with people like themselves.
Did you ever think about this 37 years ago? Did you think this-
No, when I was in Willowbrook, I thought I was gonna die.
Bernard sat down with me inside his apartment. He never had an intellectual disability. What he has is cerebral palsy.
When I used to give out cookies and candy, I used to throw it on the floor. And as I got older, I began to realize this is not normal.
Now at 67 years old, Bernard is an advocate for people with disabilities.
There are 5,300 patients at Willowbrook.
Dr. Michael Wilkins worked at Willowbrook for almost 2 years and is forever haunted by what took place there.
The main aspect of Willowbrook was that it was a penal colony, not a school.
In 1965, Robert F. Kennedy toured Willowbrook. What he found was shocking.
I visited the State Institution for the Mentally Retarded, and I think that particularly at Willowbrook that we have a situation that borders on a snake there.
Despite his call for change, nothing changed. In fact, it got worse. Overcrowded, understaffed, underfunded. Willowbrook initially lost 600 employees when New York State struggled financially. In 1971, the state slashed the budget a second time.
There were 3 minutes that were allowed for the staff to feed each person. Yeah, with big spoons and mush, and they would hold their head up like a baby bird.
This went on for 7 years. Enter Geraldo Rivera, who got cameras inside the institution, exposing what was really going on inside this state school.
So I had the stolen key, and I opened the door, and the first thing you are hit by the smell. The smell hits you even before the sound. And it was like, oh, what is that? It smells of disease and death. What is that?
Geraldo went back, this time on an authorized tour.
While unannounced, we found the children naked and basically unattended. They were shown kids who were fully clothed and generously attended.
A dog and pony show also presented to Alan Goldstein, whose brother Fred is a survivor of Willowbrook.
They cleaned everyone up. The hallways were shiny. They smelled of urine. I couldn't figure that out.
Not even their charade could conceal what was behind closed doors.
One child who was this tall would see us and she'd yell out, "Daddy! Daddy! Daddy!" And then there were 6 of them. And then there were 12 of them. And then there were 30 of them.
Geraldo went back to Willowbrook again without permission.
It was the first day all over again.
Is there one thing that takes you back that will never leave you?
will always be haunted by one particularly poignant image of a young man, pants were down around his ankles, in the bathroom, and he was under the sink. That's what.
His documentary catapulted Willowbrook into the national spotlight. In 1975, the state signed a consent decree starting the largest effort to deinstitutionalize people with developmental disabilities. Willowbrook was finally closed down in 1987, 15 years after cameras revealed its dark secrets.
It's something that is so hair-raising, so horrifying, that even from the perspective of so many years later, I just can't get over it.
It became known as a dumping ground for children with disabilities. On average, the ratio of patients to doctors, 50-3.
It's like a waiting room at Grand Central Station or something, and there were just the rope.
So I show that to you just so we don't think that the rest of the world is awful, but we're doing great things in the United States. So these conditions that I've been showing you have existed in institutions across the world, and they're not a big secret, but it's never been an occasion during the entire 20th century to make them the subject of a Human Rights Convention until 2006. Now, one of the most important things in the area of human rights in the 20th century was the passage in 1948 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations. About 10 years, this happened about 10 years before the Aroostook County Association began its formation. Now, what is significant about the Universal Declaration is the word universal, which goes to the core of protection that everybody is entitled to just by virtue of their status as a human being. It contains sweeping language that is applicable to all and to everyone. And there are no explicit exceptions in this language about who is entitled to these protections of their human rights. But despite the very progressive ideals that were embodied in this declaration, one must remember that it was a product of its time. And one of the problems with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was that, like other generic documents, many people and many governments thought that it could not possibly have been meant to include everyone, especially people with disabilities. So, as one example of the assumed exclusion of people with disabilities from generic protections, it's useful to recall what was going on at that time in the world in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. Among the many revelations that horrified the world were the stories that emerged about experiments that were done by the Nazis and by the Japanese on human beings, many of whom were prisoners of war or other captives. As a reaction to these revelations, the Nuremberg Code of 1947 was adopted. And this code made it very clear that experimentation could not be done without consent, the voluntary consent of people who had capacity to consent and the ability to exercise the free power of choice. Now here again, the language is pretty clear. It doesn't make any exceptions. And if there was any doubt, just shortly thereafter, another international covenant on civil and political rights was adopted. And this, by the way, is binding international law on the 152 countries that have signed on to this convention. And Article 7 states that no one shall be subject to torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. In particular, no one shall be subjected without his free consent to medical or scientific experimentation. Again, there are no exclusions for this. So, let's just do a small experiment here before I go on. let's say I'm a researcher and I want to cure Ebola, which is killing lots of people. And I need human subjects to volunteer for this experiment. And you don't have Ebola. You're not at risk of getting Ebola. And by the way, if you volunteer to be in this experiment, there is a pretty good chance, a high risk, that you might suffer serious and permanent harm. With that disclosure, how many of you would consent to join an experiment to test a new drug? You're volunteering him? So this is what happened. In the context of research protection, the widespread view in the research community was that despite this plain language in Article 7, they could not have meant to include people with mental disabilities. So respected researchers at respected institutions, some of which were just a stone's throw away from the UN building on 41st Street in Manhattan, continued to perform experiments at high levels of risk upon people with mental impairments without any consent at all, and they didn't do this in secret. They published their research in the most respected journals and disclosed their methods, and they did it with impunity. The research that was conducted during the Second World War into diseases like malaria and dysentery and influenza frequently used the residents of state institutions with the mentally ill and the mentally retarded as their human subjects without any consent at all. And these are not problems that occurred only in distant places. In Massachusetts, which housed many, many residents from Maine, radiation experiments were conducted on institutionalized mentally retarded adolescents at the Fernald State School. Yes, the same Fernald who was here talking about feeble-minded people. These experiments were conducted by putting radioactive iodine into their cereal to test the effects of radiation on the human body. Their parents were told that they were getting extra vitamins, and the inducement for the parental consent on behalf of these adolescents was that the kids who were volunteered for these experiments would get to go to the beach at Cape Cod and would get to see a baseball game of the Red Sox once in each summer. At the Willowbrook School that you just saw, less than 20 miles from the United Nations headquarters, residents were deliberately infected with the Lyme hepatitis virus in order to study transmission patterns, while researchers told their parents they were receiving vaccines. The inducement to consent was that the kids who participated in the research would move off the general wards of Willowbrook into the research wards that were better staffed and had better conditions. The point I'm making is the generic recognition of human rights for all people has historically been insufficient to bring people with mental disabilities under the same umbrella, because there's been a long history of regarding them as people with separate and lesser human rights. Separate but equal was not a great education policy. Separate and unequal has been disastrous to people with mental disabilities. So in succeeding years, as greater consciousness developed about the plight of people with mental and physical disabilities, the United Nations adopted a bunch of additional declarations of their rights. So we have, in succeeding years, 71, the Declaration of Rights of the Mentally Retarded, 75, Rights of Disabled Persons, 1991, Protection of People with Mental Illness, and then the Standard Rules for Equalization of Opportunities in 1993. Now, each of these declarations and principles added more language to make it a little bit more explicit, to apply more directly to the circumstances of people with mental disabilities. But, here's the kicker, unlike the international covenants, which are binding international law, these are neither enforceable nor do they have any mechanism for monitoring their compliance with them. But that's not the only problem. The Declaration of the Rights of Mentally Retarded Persons was a very progressive document for its time in recognizing that people with mental retardation had any rights at all. Because remember, they were put in experiments and so on without consent. And at the time that this declaration in 1975 was adopted, states like New York, states like Maine, states like Alabama, Pennsylvania, were busy fighting class action lawsuits defending the conditions in their institutions as complying with law. So the Declaration on the Rights of People with Mental Retardation essentially said that people with mental retardation have the same rights as was in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it said this applies to this group of people. But the kicker was the final paragraph in that declaration, which says that when mentally retarded persons are unable, because of the severity of their handicap, to exercise all of their rights in a meaningful way, or it should become necessary to restrict or deny some of these rights, the procedure used for that restriction or denial must contain proper legal safeguards against every form of abuse. The procedure must be based upon an evaluation of the social capability of the mentally retarded person by qualified experts and must be subject to periodic review and the right of appeal to higher authorities. So this final paragraph focuses not on the substance of the rights that it was supposedly granting, but on a procedure by which you could take them away. In essence, as unenforceable as these rights were, they could still be limited based on vague standards applied by unspecified experts. No doubt people like Dr. Walter Farnold, who worked in institutions like Willowbrook and Penhurst, and helped defend their conditions against legal challenges. And the appeal to higher authority, who is the higher authority? The person who hired the experts. So these legal and human rights, not only were they not well protected, but the political support for the institutions that were created to confine them was weak as well, with the result that they did not fare well in the annual competition for fiscal resources from the governor and the legislature in various states. So they became places of overcrowding and understaffing where abuse and neglect were pervasive. Even the American Association of Mental Deficiency, which was the professional association of all the superintendents of institutions across America, they acknowledged in 1964 in a document which was trying to set up some standards for these institutions. They said the institutions could not offer much more than the barest level of existence, that they had a tradition of neglect, and that conditions, even at the best of state institutions, were far too low. Eventually, these institutions became the target of lawsuits instigated by parents and concerned professionals, aided by reform-minded lawyers. The initial goal was to try to improve the conditions in the institutions. But after several years of trying, it soon became evident that these improvements were incapable of being achieved. And so the reform efforts focused on closing the institutions entirely. So the deinstitutionalization movement that started in the 1970s with a series of lawsuits eventually led to the erosion of the medical model and the creation of community services. But once again, the reform, which is driven by conscience, ran into the ugly head of convenience, as the initial group homes created by parents out of their own hard work was soon converted into more institution-like little places, mostly to chase after federal money. But despite these setbacks along the way, in the broad sweep of time, the conditions that we've seen in these institutions have in fact been eroded. But the tug between conscience and convenience continues to play itself out. In the United States, we have made almost unimaginable progress in the field of mental disabilities over the past 60 years, especially when it comes to articulated policies, to laws and regulations, and recognition of human rights. We've had more flexible financing options, and the sheer availability of federal funds to support services for people with disabilities has grown by leaps and bounds. Having spent the last 30 years engaged in public policy decisions involving people with mental and intellectual disabilities, first as a counsel to the governor of New York and then as a head of an independent agency, and in monitoring these class action lawsuits, I've had the opportunity to witness the tremendous success and the serious vulnerabilities of the system. Perhaps the most overwhelming accomplishment, and one which is directly traceable to the efforts of parents and their allies and their persistence, and one that we've come to take for granted today, is that we no longer face the stark horrors of an institution like Willowbrook, or Pineland, or Partlow, which once was the epitome of what these institutions could do. People lived wasted lives with no alternative in these places. Today, those images are largely history. Tens of thousands of people who lived in these wretched conditions have had the opportunity to move to the community and lead more normal lives. And more importantly, tens of thousands will never face the prospect of having their lives confined to these living wastelands. And over the past 30 years, thousands and thousands of individuals with mental disabilities have had the freedom to lead more normal lives in the community, to live in their own homes, or supported housing, to hold jobs, to make decisions for themselves. And perhaps the most dramatic difference has been made in the lives of children with disabilities who have had the opportunity to attend neighborhood schools, to develop friendships with other children, and maintain their connections with family and friends as they grow into adulthood. The futures that await them are vastly different than what would have been the case not long ago. From this perspective, the accomplishments are nothing short of astounding. Almost the entire agenda that the most visionary advocate could have thought about in the 1970s has come to pass. The passage of laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act, fair housing amendments, the growth of Medicaid home and community-based waivers, flexibility in how to spend money. So the unfulfilled promise is not in the laws, it's not in the regulations, but it's in the practice and implementation side of the equation. And again, the tension between conscience and convenience continues to play out. So I'd like to talk about 4 specific challenges that confront what has been one of the most successful reforms in the last century. The first is the shortage of direct service workers that's caused by different trends that have been occurring. This includes the aging of the population and increasing demands for care for the frail elderly, along with people with disabilities. And there's also a growing population of people with disabilities who will require significant assistance as they not only are disabled but also are aging. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there'll be a need for over 1 million additional workers by 2024, a 26% increase over the decade. But the population of people who fill these jobs, which are overwhelmingly women at the ages of 25 to 64, will increase at a much slower rate. Also, as the economy has begun to recover since the Obama administration and has continued to recover, there will be increased job opportunities for people to migrate from direct service jobs that are difficult into other jobs which pay the same or better and are far less demanding. Turnover rates in these direct service jobs continue to skyrocket. And one can also expect that trend to continue. And paradoxically, considering what's happening on the national stage, a disproportionate amount of direct service work is performed by immigrants from third world countries. And that's true in most of the United States. Restricting immigration and deporting these workers is not going to improve the ability to fully staff these jobs. So the second thing that's probably less visible is the effect of the ending of these major class action lawsuits like the one in Pineland. And I think people who live in Maine are probably acutely aware of what has happened since that lawsuit ended. These lawsuits had not only spurred the downsizing and closure of state institutions, but more importantly, they placed a lot of pressure on the state government to finance the development of community services so people didn't jump from one neglectful place to another. Many of these lawsuits that had their genesis in the 1970s and 80s continued to influence the allocation of resources well into the 90s and 2000s. But as they came to an end, so did the pressure on state governments to maintain funding for human service systems which had been under court orders. In states like Maine and other places, we've seen significant declines in funding after judicial oversight came to an end, especially during the years of the fiscal crisis that started in 2007 and 2008. The third big trend are the cutbacks in Medicaid. Medicaid has served as the engine which has financed reforms all over the country. This is sometimes also accompanied by pressures from state governments to cut the Medicaid budget. The Home and Community-Based Waiver Program, for example, witnessed explosive growth in the numbers of people served and in the range of services it financed. The number of people with intellectual disabilities who were served under that Medicaid program grew from approximately 1,300 in 1982 to 769,000 in 2017. This single program enabled states to tackle their waiting lists and to offer hope to families who are struggling to care for a relative with disabilities. Although there are over 473,000 people still on the waiting list in 2017, and that list is growing at a rate of 8 to 9% a year. The Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, has provided significant financial inducements to those states which took advantage of it to use the Medicaid program to expand health care coverage, and a significant segment of the beneficiaries have been people with disabilities. Policies now being considered in Congress to cap Medicaid allocations to the states, to block grant it, and to eventually cut it, will have a disproportionate effect upon people with disabilities who have been the prime beneficiaries of long-term care expenditures financed by Medicaid. In a related vein, the new generation of civil rights litigation under a case called Olmstead, which essentially says the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits segregating people in institution-like facilities just because they're disabled. So unlike the first generation of deinstitutionalization cases, which led to developing community residences and other certified programs, Olmstead essentially has allowed states to place people into supported housing, which is typically unlicensed and has much less oversight and standards for the programs that are being created. And what we are seeing in many parts of the country are the effects of weak regulation and weak oversight of these new programs and media scandals that have been erupting in many states. One way of sort of conceptualizing the importance of safeguards is to sort of think about the layers of things that typically happen in order to make sure people are protected. So if you think about the base of a pyramid, you've got the ability of people to protect themselves, and of course the quality and training of the direct care staff who interact with them on a daily basis. If that's the first thing, and then of course having an involved family is a very important safeguard, having friends in the community, co-workers, people in the community who know you, access to advocates and case managers, and having some good laws and policies. Now, if you start taking away, on the other side, you have supervision, provider administration, boards of directors, independent financial oversight, accreditation, monitoring, and elected officials. If everything on this side gets weakened, you're left with this. And if people don't have friends and family and co-workers in the community, they're really exposed to a lot of risk. So traditionally, we've relied upon these systems of incident reporting and investigations and corrective action. But as we migrate to a different paradigm for providing these sorts of services, the volume of risks that people are exposed to continue to increase. So these trends that are occurring present a huge challenge to all of us who are concerned about the policy of community living and who support it. And the highly visible failures that have been experienced in some places around the country are being used to push back against efforts to close unnecessary institutional beds, as if the solution for public policy failures is to incarcerate the victims. It is therefore incumbent upon all of us to continue to be advocates for policy and to make sure that the government is doing its job in monitoring the service systems that are being developed. In my experience, the shift from acting on conscience to acquiescing in the demands of convenience is rarely marked by a precipice over which somebody chooses to jump into the abyss. It more often happens in small and seemingly insignificant ways, down a slope when no one but you is aware that you are taking the steps. And there alone, with your conscience, each of us must decide where we stand in protecting the human rights of people with disabilities. We've seen through history that despite the most lofty ideals that we can enshrine in law, these rights remain vulnerable just because the stigma of disability has run so deep in the human condition. The real lesson that one draws from history is that the job of advocacy is never done. The same persistence, the same vigilance that parents, professionals, and legal advocates demonstrated through the dark days of institutions like Willowbrook and Pineland are still needed. And in some ways, the job of advocacy is much more difficult today. Mercifully today, there's no stark horror like Willowbrook to galvanize even the most stone-hearted person. The evil that we deal with is more subtle. It's the unstated acceptance of a lesser status of citizenship, a lesser scope of human rights, and ultimately a lesser standing as a human being before the law and in society for people with disabilities. The evil that we're fighting is isolation, loneliness, neglect, which are more subtle problems and are sometimes camouflaged by words like choice and empowerment, which communicate concepts with which we all agree. But case managers and advocates and parents and professionals, all of us, need to remain vigilant and alert and astute enough to look past the words in bills of rights and treaties and statutes and conventions to the underlying reality of the quality of life for the people that we care about. There is no safety net that can bear the weight of human indifference. As I close, I'd like to leave you with some words from Eleanor Roosevelt, who played a critical role in the process leading to the adoption by the United Nations of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She said, "Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity, without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we should look in vain for progress in the larger world." Thank you. Questions, comments?
I have one.
Yes.
How would you, how do you fix a problem when the other disabilities make fun of you? Do you have a reason for that?
I wish I did. It's a very strong and very serious problem. Changing people's attitudes is hard. In my experience, people stop making fun of other people when they come to know them as people. It's easy to make fun of somebody you don't know, but when you know somebody and you have a relationship with them, it's hard to make fun of them. Anybody else? Yeah.
Do you feel our present laws have the right balance in terms of providing people a choice and protecting those same people from the choices they make?
That's an excellent question. I was just sharing with Steve a monograph I put together 20 years ago on exactly that tension between autonomy on the one hand and the responsibility on the other. There is, unfortunately in this field, a lot of misunderstanding about core concepts like the presumption of competence So when you see somebody with a disability making a really bad judgment, and I'll give you an example of somebody a case that I actually know. This person had been discharged from an institution, had been living in the community for a while. He eventually moved to his own apartment. And so he had income from SSI, he had personal allowance, and he had his own apartment. And he was living in Manhattan. And he soon found that there were people in the neighborhood who befriended him, and he'd never had friends. And next thing he knew, these people had essentially moved into his apartment, and it became party central. And next thing he knew, they were dealing drugs out of his apartment, and there were all kinds of nefarious things going on. And he didn't know how to say no. He didn't know how to say, you know, this is the line of friendship that you can't cross. He eventually got evicted from his apartment. And when we asked the agency that was supporting him, why was the case manager, who was aware of what was going on, why did he step in to prevent this? He said, well, he's entitled to make his choices. And it really presents the conundrum, right? If you grow up in a normal way, you learn about decision-making incrementally. When you've spent your whole formative years in an institution and have not had any choices to make because they don't allow you to, all of a sudden you come out as a 25-year-old with no life experience. In my view, I think it's incumbent upon the professionals who are supporting that person to exercise professional judgment. And the presumption of competence doesn't apply when you know that the individual you're dealing with has an intellectual disability. It requires you to exercise some level of professional judgment to make sure that person has enough information, enough knowledge about the decisions they're making, and is free to make a decision to say yes or no.
But ultimately, you're asking that qualified person to make a value judgment.
Yes.
So you're okay with that?
I'm perfectly okay with that because in my previous job, when I was monitoring services and investigating abuse and neglect, I saw so many instances of people coming to serious harm. You know, young women who were being sexually exploited by people carrying HIV and who had no idea of what HIV was. They didn't know anything about how they would protect themselves. They didn't understand the consequences. Forget pregnancy, they could die. And I think in those circumstances, you know, the old Boy Scout in me says safety first.
Thank you.
Yes.
Clarence, in the topic of advocacy, you mentioned that the Court of Institutions aren't here anymore, but there is a new challenge today because of funding and regulations. What is the best way for parents to advocate for their sons and daughters?
Well, I think the most important thing is to raise your voices. I mean, the reason why human services historically has done very badly in the fight over resources in the legislature is that the loud voices are, you know, organized lobbying groups. Number one, they give money to politicians, which, you know, gets their voices heard. But secondly, they come out and they are visible, they're vocal, and so on. The stigma of disability historically has kept parents from identifying themselves as a relative of somebody with a significant disability, and that's weakened their voices. Now, if you look at two different populations in this country, you've got people with intellectual disabilities on one hand, and you've got people with mental illness on the other. The group with intellectual disabilities has done a far superior job in organizing themselves, in, you know, embracing the idea that they have to protect their children, and identifying themselves as parents, brothers, sisters of their relatives, and have become effective advocates with legislatures. So if you look at the trend of how financing has gone for programs to support them in the community, it's done far, far better than the population with mental illness, because the stigma of mental illness is still so much greater. You still think of the image of somebody who has a mental illness as being a potential criminal, who's going to commit a murder, who's going to, you know, stab somebody on the streets. Now, it doesn't matter that if you look at facts, people with mental illness are far more likely to be the victim of a crime than to be a perpetrator. But the stigma prevents people from being as effective advocates as they could be. But the other thing that you're doing so effectively here, which I think is really important, is you've got all kinds of allies in this community. You've got businesses that support what you're doing. You've got not only the time, the treasure that they give you with money, but so many volunteers who come out to help organizations like this do the work it does. And that brings you connections to people who can be heard on your behalf. So I think that's the direction that you need to be going in. Yes?
I was wondering about the safeguard pyramid, and wondering if the elements on the bottom have higher value, more important, or if it's like a pyramid as far as being the foundation. I'm wondering about the two. I'm just curious about that. There's a lot to it.
It is actually intended to show that really the power of the pyramid is in the base. Right? So if people have the ability to protect themselves, that's the most effective thing. On the other side of the pyramid, the people that you deal with on a day-to-day basis and most frequently are the direct care workers. So if the quality of that staff and their commitment and their training and their value structure is good, those are the two things that are going to keep you safe. Where you start running into risk is where you don't have an ability of self-protection and the other side of the pyramid is weak. And then you have to start relying on, is the program being supervised adequately? Are the regulations good? Are the monitors coming around? But once you get away from that base, it's all weaker all the way up. And as we've seen, the top of the pyramid where you have statutes and laws and policies, they can be completely meaningless unless you've got a capacity to implement them. Yes?
You mentioned Highland consent decree, and I know you were the special master. So can you tell us a little bit about what your responsibilities were with that and what happened?
Yeah. Well, when courts have complicated cases that require some kind of specialized knowledge, and a federal judge may be a very smart person, but when it comes to thinking about how do you translate this set of laws into policies and implementation, they don't have the skill set to do that. So they typically, and they don't have the time because they've got hundreds of cases. So they would appoint a special master to basically take the responsibility of supervising the implementation of those court orders. So in the Pineland case, there was a consent decree that required the state to essentially relocate people who were at Pineland into community settings. And those community settings have to meet a certain set of standards. When they wrote the consent decree, the standard was sort of vague. And there was a lot of disagreement between the plaintiffs and the state about what exactly do these standards mean. And I think that led to a lot of legal argumentation back and forth, but it wasn't moving the ball forward. So my job was really to help both the parties to come to some common understanding of what would it take to accomplish this goal that would satisfy everybody, and incrementally to help the state come into compliance with those standards. And when it did come into compliance, to be able to measure it and say, okay, they've complied with this, so they can be released from the court order.
Clarence, on behalf of our association, I want to thank you very much for coming up and doing the lecture here tonight, and just really appreciate all the words of wisdom that you have to receive.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.